What if the ice that covered half the world did not melt slowly over thousands of years? What if it vanished in a catastrophe so sudden that ancient people recorded it in stone, clay, and memory, and those records still whisper the truth today? Stand for a moment in the cold wind that sweeps across the frozen plains of what was once the Ice Age world. The air bites at your skin. The ground beneath your feet is hard, unyielding, locked in frost that has not released its grip for 30,000 years. Glaciers stretch to the horizon, rivers of ice 2 miles thick, crawling across continents like frozen oceans. Mammoths walk below, their thick fur swaying in the wind. Saber-toothed cats prowl through valleys that will one day become farmland, cities, highways. But today this world belongs to the ice. And then something changes. The ice begins to melt, not gently, but violently, catastrophically, as if the Earth itself has decided to erase an entire age in the span of a human lifetime. Within decades, the glaciers are collapsing. Within centuries, the coastlines are drowning. Within 1,000 years, half the animals on Earth are gone, and the survivors are running, fleeing inland from floods that swallow entire valleys, entire nations, entire worlds. And someone was there to see it happen. Someone remembered. Someone carved the story into stone tablets, painted it on temple walls, wove it into songs that grandparents sang to children for 10,000 years until finally, we forgot that it was real. But the records did not forget. They are still here, buried beneath desert sands, hidden in flooded caves, locked inside ice older than pyramids. And they all say the same thing. The Ice Age did not end slowly. It ended in fire, water, and terror. And the people who survived spent the rest of their lives trying to warn us. Before we go further into this frozen world, take a moment. Hit like and subscribe to this channel. But only if you are the kind of person who wants to hear the stories that sleep between history and legend. The ones that refuse to stay buried. And if you are still here, leave a comment. Tell me where you are listening from right now. Tell me what hour keeps you company. I imagine this ancient story traveling across oceans and time zones, carried softly into your night. Wherever you are in the world, let us begin at the beginning. Not the beginning we were taught in school, but the real beginning. The one the ice remembers. The Ice Age is not a myth, it is a fact. For nearly 100,000 years, massive sheets of ice covered the northern half of the Earth. Canada, Europe, Asia, all buried under glaciers so thick they pressed the land itself downward, reshaping the crust of the planet. The ice was not static. It advanced and retreated in cycles, breathing in and out over thousands of years, following rhythms scientists still do not fully understand. But around 20,000 years ago, something began to shift. The climate started to warm, slowly at first. The glaciers began their retreat. Animals that had adapted to the cold followed the ice northward. Humans, clever and resilient, expanded into the lands the ice had abandoned. For thousands of years this warming continued, steady, predictable, natural. And then, around 12,000 years ago, something went terribly wrong. Geologists call it the Younger Dryas period. For reasons that remain hotly debated, the warming stopped. The climate plunged back toward Ice Age conditions almost overnight. Temperatures dropped by 15 degrees in some regions within decades. The glaciers that had been melting began to grow again. Animals that had migrated north found themselves trapped in a world turning cold once more. Entire species began to collapse. Woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, animals that had survived hundreds of thousands of years began to vanish. But this cold snap did not last. After 1,000 years, the climate lurched again, this time toward warmth. And this time, the warming was not gentle. It was explosive. The glaciers melted so fast that rivers of ice water poured into the oceans, raising sea levels by hundreds of feet. Coastlines that had been home to human settlements for thousands of years disappeared beneath the waves. Islands became reefs. Valleys became bays. Entire landscapes drowned. Scientists have spent decades trying to understand what caused this. Was it a shift in ocean currents? A change in the Earth's orbit? Volcanic eruptions filling the sky with ash? Some researchers now believe the trigger was extraterrestrial. A comet, breaking apart in the atmosphere, raining fragments down onto the ice sheets, melting them from above, destabilizing the entire climate system in a matter of days. The evidence for this is growing. In sediment layers dated to 12,800 years ago, researchers have found a thin black layer rich in platinum, a metal rare on Earth but common in asteroids and comets. They have found microscopic diamonds, formed under the intense heat and pressure of an impact. They have found charcoal, evidence of massive wildfires that swept across entire continents. And in Greenland, beneath the ice, they have found what may be impact craters, scars from the sky frozen in time. But here is what makes this story strange. Here is the part that keeps scientists awake at night, staring at charts and data that refuse to make sense. The ancient people knew about this. They recorded it. They described it in detail. They told the story over and over, in every language, in every culture, on every continent, and we dismissed it as myth. The Sumerians, writing on clay tablets in southern Iraq 5,000 years ago, described a great flood that destroyed the world before their time. They listed kings who ruled before the flood, kings with reigns lasting tens of thousands of years. After the flood, they said, kingship descended from heaven again, and civilization had to be rebuilt from nothing. The Egyptians carved inscriptions on temple walls describing the first time, an age when gods walked the earth and the Nile Valley was green and lush. They spoke of a great catastrophe that ended that age, forcing humanity to start over. The Hebrews preserved the story of Noah, a flood that drowned the earth, survivors in a boat, and the slow rebuilding of the world afterward. The Greeks told of Deucalion and Para, lone survivors of a deluge sent by Zeus to cleanse the earth. The Hindus described Manu, warned by a fish of coming floods, saving himself and the knowledge of civilization in a great ship. The Chinese recorded the great floods, tamed by the hero Gun and his son Yu, who spent decades channeling the waters and making the land safe again. The Maya, the Inca, the Hopi, the Aztec, the indigenous peoples of North America, Australia, and the Pacific Islands, all of them told the same story. The world was destroyed by water. A few survived. Civilization began again. For centuries, scholars assumed these were just stories, allegories, moral lessons dressed up as history. Floods happen everywhere, they said. Of course, every culture has a flood myth. It means nothing. But then the geologists started digging, and they found the flood. Not one flood, a series of catastrophic flooding events, all occurring between 12,000 and 6,000 years ago. Exactly when the ancient texts said they did. At the ancient city of Ur in southern Iraq, archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating royal tombs in 1922 when his workers hit something strange. Below the rubble of the city, below the pottery and tools and bones of ordinary life, they found a thick layer of clean silt, water-deposited silt, 8 feet of it, sterile, untouched, the kind of layer left behind by massive, sustained flooding. And below that silt layer, Woolley found more ruins, older pottery, older tools, an earlier civilization, buried and forgotten beneath the flood. The same pattern appeared at other sites across Mesopotamia, Kish, Shuruppak, Uruk. All of them had flood layers. All of them dated to roughly the same period, between 3,500 and 2,900 years before the Common Era. But that was just the beginning. When scientists began mapping sea levels over the past 20,000 years, they discovered something astonishing. Between 12,000 and 6,000 years ago, global sea levels rose by over 400 feet, not gradually, in pulses, sudden surges of meltwater pouring into the oceans as glaciers collapsed. The first pulse, called Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred around 14,600 years ago. Sea levels rose 65 feet in just a few centuries. Entire coastlines vanished. Any settlements along those coasts would have been drowned, erased, buried under hundreds of feet of water. The second pulse, Meltwater Pulse 1B, hit around 11,300 years ago. Another 25 feet of sea level rise, more coastlines gone, more land swallowed by the sea. By 6,000 years ago, the oceans had stabilized near modern levels. But by then over 400 feet of coastline had been lost. And since most human populations throughout history have lived near coastlines, near rivers, near water sources, the archaeological evidence of any Ice Age civilization would now be underwater, invisible, unreachable, unless you know where to look. In recent decades, underwater archaeologists have begun finding strange structures on continental shelves around the world. Off the coast of India near the legendary city of Dwarka, sonar has detected geometric patterns on the seafloor, walls, platforms, foundations, structures that would have been built when sea levels were lower, before the floods came. Near the Japanese island of Yonaguni, divers have found massive stone formations with right angles, straight edges, and what appear to be carved steps. The formations sit in water that was dry land during the Ice Age, before 10,000 years ago. In the Mediterranean, entire Neolithic settlements now lie submerged. Atlit Yam off the coast of Israel, Pavlopetri near Greece, structures that were thriving villages before the seas rose and drowned them. Between Britain and mainland Europe, there once existed a land called Doggerland, a subcontinent-sized region of rivers, forests, and marshes. Fishing nets occasionally pull up stone tools, mammoth bones, and evidence of human habitation from what is now the floor of the North Sea. Doggerland supported tens of thousands of people during the Ice Age. By 6,500 years ago, it was gone, completely submerged. The same story repeats across Southeast Asia. The Sunda Shelf, a massive landmass connecting Indonesia, Malaysia, and mainland Asia, drowned between 12,000 and 6,000 years ago. Australia was connected to New Guinea by a land bridge now beneath the Torres Strait. The Bering Land Bridge linking Asia and North America disappeared under the waves. Entire subcontinents vanished, and with them any cities, any settlements, any civilizations that might have existed there. This is why the ancient records matter. Because the people who wrote them were not inventing stories. They were remembering. They were preserving the memory of a world that ended, a world that drowned, a world that existed before the glaciers melted and the seas rose and the coastlines vanished. The Sumerians were not describing mythology when they listed kings who ruled before the flood. They were preserving a chronology. The Egyptians were not creating religious theater when they spoke of the first time. They were recording history. The flood myths from around the world were not allegories. They were eyewitness accounts, passed down through generations, distorted by time and translation, but rooted in a real event. The Ice Age did not end slowly. It ended in a series of catastrophes that reshaped the planet. And the people who lived through it, the survivors who watched their world drown, made certain their children would remember. They carved the story into stone, they painted it on walls, they sang it in songs. They wove it into the fabric of every religion, every myth, every origin story humanity has ever told. And now, 12,000 years later, we are finally beginning to listen. The glaciers melted, the seas rose, the coastlines drowned. The old world vanished beneath the waves, and in the chaos something else was lost: knowledge, civilization, history itself. But not all of it. Some fragments survive, carried forward by refugees who fled inland from the rising waters, preserved in oral traditions passed down through generations, encoded in myths that refused to die. And eventually, when humanity had rebuilt enough stability to write again, those fragments were pressed into clay, carved into stone, and hidden in temples, libraries, and tombs. The oldest written records on Earth are not describing the beginning of civilization. They are describing what came after the end. And if we are willing to read them, really read them, they tell us something terrifying and beautiful. We have been here before. Humanity has risen before. We have built before. We have forgotten before. And the cycle may not be finished. The ice remembers, the stones remember, the water remembers, and now so do we. The story begins not with scientists or satellites, but with a shovel. A shovel driven into the dry earth of southern Iraq in the year 1849. The man holding that shovel was Austen Henry Layard, a British archaeologist who had heard rumors of ancient cities buried beneath the desert. Cities with names that appeared in the Bible: Nineveh, Babylon, names that had become legend, whispered in religious texts but lost to history for thousands of years. Layard did not know what he would find. He could not have imagined that beneath his feet lay the answers to questions humanity had been asking since the beginning of recorded time. Questions about floods, about lost worlds, about the end of the Ice Age. He began to dig, and the earth began to speak. Within weeks, Layard's workers unearthed thousands of clay tablets, small rectangles of baked mud covered in strange wedge-shaped marks. The marks were writing, ancient writing, the oldest writing anyone had ever seen. The tablets were fragile, crumbling at the edges, but the words pressed into them 4,000 years ago were still readable, still waiting. Scholars called the writing cuneiform. It was the script of the Sumerians, a civilization that had flourished in Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, starting around 3,500 years before the Common Era. The Sumerians were not the first people in that region, but they were the first to write, the first to leave behind records that could be read, translated, and understood. And what those records said changed everything. Among the thousands of tablets Layard discovered was one that would become famous. It was part of a longer text, an epic poem about a king named Gilgamesh. The story was beautiful, tragic, and deeply human. But it was the 11th tablet that made scholars stop and stare in disbelief. The 11th tablet told the story of a great flood, a flood that covered the entire earth, a flood that destroyed all life except for one man, his family, and the animals he saved in a boat. The man's name was Utnapishtim. He had been warned by the gods that the flood was coming. He built a massive ship, sealed it with tar, loaded it with animals and supplies, and waited. The rains came, the waters rose, the world drowned, and when the flood finally ended, Utnapishtim's boat came to rest on a mountain. He released birds to search for dry land. A dove returned, a swallow returned, but a raven did not return. The raven had found land. The world was emerging again from the water. The story was almost identical to the biblical account of Noah, but the Sumerian version was older, much older. The tablet containing the flood story dated to around 1650 years before the Common Era, but the story itself, scholars realized, was far more ancient. It had been copied from earlier sources that stretched back to the very beginning of Sumerian civilization. The Sumerians were not inventing this story. They were preserving it, passing it down, recording it so it would not be lost. But the flood story was not the only record they left behind. Another tablet, called the Sumerian King List, presented something even stranger. The King List was a chronological record of all the rulers of Sumer, starting from the very beginning. It began with a simple statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Then it listed the kings. The first king was named Alulam. His reign lasted 28,800 years. The second king Aloljar ruled for 36,000 years. The third king, Emenloana, ruled for 43,200 years. 8 kings were listed before the flood. Their combined reigns totaled 241,200 years. Then the text stated matter-of-factly, without drama or emotion. Then the flood swept over. After the flood the king list continued. But something had changed. The reigns were shorter. Still impossibly long by modern standards, but gradually decreasing. The first king after the flood ruled for 18,000 years. The next for 12,000. Then 8,000. Then 4,000. Eventually, by the time the list reached kings whose names appear in other historical records, the reigns had dropped to believable human lifespans: 60 years, 40 years, 25 years. Scholars did not know what to make of this. Were the numbers symbolic? Were they mistakes in translation? Were they exaggerations meant to glorify ancient kings? Or were they recording something real, something we no longer understand? The pattern was too specific to be random. Before the flood, impossibly long reigns. After the flood, a gradual return to normal human lifespans, as if the world itself had changed, as if the rules of time or life or civilization had been reset. And the Sumerians were not alone in recording this pattern. Halfway across the ancient world, in the land of Egypt, priests were carving similar records into temple walls. In the temple of Seti I at Abydos, there exists a long list of pharaohs stretching back through Egyptian history. The list is carved in neat rows, each name enclosed in a cartouche, each reign carefully documented. But the list does not stop with the first pharaoh. It continues backward, past the familiar dynasties, past the pyramids, into a section labeled the first time, the time of the gods. According to the inscriptions, Egypt was ruled by divine beings before human pharaohs took the throne. These divine rulers, called the Neteru, reigned for thousands of years, some for 10,000 years, some for 15,000. The Egyptian priest Manetho, writing around 280 years before the Common Era, compiled a history of Egypt that included these divine dynasties. He listed gods who ruled for 13,900 years, followed by demigods who ruled for 11,000 years, before the first human pharaoh finally appeared. Modern Egyptologists dismissed these numbers as mythology, religious symbolism, poetic exaggeration, but they could not dismiss the physical evidence. In 1858, French archaeologist Auguste Mariette discovered a papyrus in the ruins of a temple near Luxor. The papyrus, now called the Turin King List, was fragmented and damaged, but the surviving sections told the same story as the Abydos inscriptions. Divine rulers with impossibly long reigns, a great catastrophe. Then human rulers with normal lifespans. And there was more. At the temple complex of Dendera, priests had inscribed a statement on the walls. They claimed the temple was not a new construction. It was a restoration, built according to plans that had been preserved from the first time. The priests were not creating. They were copying, following blueprints from an age so ancient they no longer fully understood it. The same claim appeared at the Temple of Horus in Edfu. Inscriptions stated clearly that the temple was built according to specifications that came down from the great primordial age. The knowledge was inherited, not invented. But the most mysterious evidence in Egypt was not written in words. It was carved by water. The Great Sphinx sits on the Giza Plateau, staring eastward toward the rising sun. Conventional Egyptology dates the Sphinx to around 2,500 years before the Common Era, crediting its construction to Pharaoh Khafra of the 4th dynasty. But in 1990, a geologist named Robert Schoch examined the Sphinx and noticed something troubling. The limestone walls of the Sphinx enclosure, the pit from which the Sphinx was carved, showed deep vertical erosion patterns. Fissures, channels, weathering that could only have been caused by one thing: water. Heavy, sustained rainfall over thousands of years. But Egypt has been a desert for over 5,000 years. The kind of rainfall needed to create the erosion shock observed has not fallen on the Giza Plateau since the African humid period ended, roughly 7,000 to 9,000 years ago. If Schoch was correct, the Sphinx was not 2,500 years old. It was at least 7,000 years old, possibly older, carved during a time when Egypt was green, wet, and lush, long before the pharaohs, long before hieroglyphics, long before the civilization we call ancient Egypt even existed. Egyptologists rejected Schoch's findings. but they could not explain the weathering. They could not explain why the Sphinx looked so different from every other monument on the plateau. And they could not explain why Egyptian priests themselves claimed their temples were restorations of something older. The evidence was piling up. Sumerian tablets describing kings before the flood. Egyptian inscriptions describing divine rulers before the dynasties. Geological evidence suggesting monuments older than recorded history. And the pattern was not limited to Mesopotamia and Egypt. In ancient Greece, the poet Hesiod wrote of 5 ages of man. The Golden Age, when gods and humans lived together. The Silver Age, when humanity began to decline. The Bronze Age, marked by war and violence. The Heroic Age, when great warriors walked the earth. And finally the Iron Age, the present age, the age of toil and suffering. Hesiod described these ages as stretching across vast spans of time, each one ending in catastrophe before the next began. In India, the sacred texts called the Puranas describe the Yuga cycles, vast epochs of time during which the world passes through golden ages and dark ages before being destroyed and reborn. One full cycle, a Mahayuga, spans 4,382,000 years. These are not vague poetic numbers, they are calculated, specific, and tied to astronomical observations of precession, the 26,000-year wobble of the Earth's axis. The ancient Maya of Central America kept detailed calendars tracking time in cycles. The current age, they said, began in 3,114 years before the Common Era. But their calendars stretched backward far beyond that, recording previous world ages that had been destroyed by jaguars, by fire, by wind, and by flood. In China, ancient records describe the great floods that reshaped the land. The hero Gun tried for 9 years to control the waters by building dams and levees, but failed. His son Yu succeeded by dredging channels and guiding the waters into rivers and seas. The floods, according to Chinese chronology, occurred during the reign of the legendary Emperor Yao, roughly 2,300 years before the Common Era. But older oral traditions place the floods much earlier, in a primordial age when the world was still forming. The Hebrew Bible preserves the story of Noah. Genesis describes a world before the flood where people lived for centuries. Adam lived 930 years. Methuselah lived 969 years. Noah himself lived 950 years. After the flood, lifespans shortened dramatically. Abraham lived 175 years. Moses lived 120 years. Within a few generations, lifespans had returned to normal. The same pattern. Long lifespans before the catastrophe, shorter lifespans after. A world that changed. A reset. The indigenous peoples of North America preserved flood traditions in their oral histories. The Hopi speak of multiple worlds destroyed and recreated. The current world, they say, is the fourth world. The previous 3 were destroyed by fire, ice, and flood. The Ojibwe tell of a great flood sent to cleanse the earth, with one man and his family surviving in a canoe. The Cree, the Haida, the Salish, the Navajo, all of them carry flood stories. In South America, the Inca recorded the story of Viracocha, a god who emerged from Lake Titicaca after a great flood to teach humanity agriculture, architecture, and astronomy. The survivors of the flood, the legends say, were few. Civilization had to be rebuilt from almost nothing. In Australia, Aboriginal oral traditions describe a time when the sea levels were lower and land is now underwater was dry. Stories passed down for thousands of years describe landmarks, islands, and coastlines that are now submerged. Modern archaeologists have confirmed that these stories accurately describe the landscape as it existed over 10,000 years ago, before the seas rose. These are not borrowed stories. They emerged independently, separated by oceans, mountains, and thousands of miles. Yet they all describe the same sequence. An advanced world existed. A catastrophe destroyed it. Water covered the earth. A few survivors preserved fragments of the old knowledge. Humanity began again. For centuries, scholars dismissed these accounts as mythology, allegory, symbolic tales meant to teach moral lessons. But then the archaeologists began to dig, and the geologists began to drill, and the evidence began to align. The flood layers at Ur-Kish and Shuropak in Mesopotamia matched the timeline described in the Sumerian tablets. The sea level rises documented in geological records matched the timeline described in myths worldwide. The sudden climate changes recorded in ice cores matched the timeline described in ancient king lists. The ancient records were not mythology, they were history. Compressed, distorted by time and translation, but rooted in real events. The people who wrote these records, the Sumerian scribes pressing wedges into soft clay, the Egyptian priests carving hieroglyphs into temple walls, the Maya astronomers tracking celestial cycles, were not inventing stories. They were preserving memory. The memory of a world that ended, a world that drowned, a world that existed before the ice melted and the seas rose and the old coastlines vanished forever beneath hundreds of feet of water. They wrote it down because they did not want their descendants to forget. They carved it in stone because stone survives. They encoded it in myth because myth outlasts empires. And now, thousands of years later, we are finally beginning to understand what they were trying to tell us. The Ice Age did not end slowly. It ended in fire and water, and the survivors spent the rest of their lives making certain we would know. For over a century, scientists believed they had solved the mystery of how the Ice Age ended. The explanation was simple, elegant, reassuring. The Earth's orbit around the Sun is not a perfect circle. It wobbles slightly. It tilts. These tiny variations, called Milankovitch cycles, change how much sunlight reaches different parts of the planet. Over tens of thousands of years, these cycles cause ice ages to begin and end, slowly, predictably, naturally. According to this theory, the Ice Age ended because the northern hemisphere began receiving more sunlight during summer months. The extra warmth melted the glaciers bit by bit, year after year, century after century. Over 10,000 years, the ice retreated northward, sea levels rose gradually. Animals migrated, humans adapted. It was a gentle transition, a natural process, nothing dramatic, nothing catastrophic. This was the story taught in textbooks, presented in museums, accepted as fact. But then scientists began looking closer at the evidence, and the evidence did not match the theory. The ice did not melt slowly, it melted explosively. In some regions, glaciers that had been stable for thousands of years collapsed within decades. Temperature records extracted from ice cores showed spikes that were too sudden, too violent to be explained by orbital changes alone. Sea level rise was not gradual, it came in pulses. Massive surges of meltwater pouring into the oceans over just a few centuries. Something else had happened. Something the simple orbital explanation could not account for. And then there was the problem of the frozen mammoths. In Siberia, northern Alaska, and the Yukon, prospectors and ivory hunters have been finding frozen mammoths for centuries. Not fossils, not bones, entire mammoths, preserved in permafrost, skin intact, fur still attached, and in some cases, food still in their mouths. In 1977, a gold miner in the Yukon discovered a baby mammoth, so perfectly preserved that scientists could examine its stomach contents. The mammoth had been eating grass and sedge when it died. Its last meal was still being digested. In 2007, a reindeer herder in Siberia found a female mammoth calf frozen in the ice. The calf, named Lyuba, was so well preserved that her internal organs were intact. Her trunk, her eyes, even her milk-filled stomach. She had been only 1 month old when she died. These animals did not die slowly. They did not starve over a long winter. They did not migrate south as the climate cooled. They died suddenly, instantly, frozen so fast that their bodies did not have time to decay. How do you freeze a mammoth so quickly that the food in its mouth does not rot? How do you preserve an animal so perfectly that 40,000 years later its flesh is still recognizable? The only explanation is rapid, catastrophic freezing. A sudden drop in temperature so extreme that death was instant. But what could cause that? What event could plunge temperatures so low so fast that massive animals died mid-meal and were locked in ice before their bodies could decompose? For decades, scientists had no answer. The slow orbital changes could not explain it. Gradual climate shifts could not explain it. The frozen mammoths remained a mystery, an anomaly, an uncomfortable piece of evidence that did not fit the accepted narrative. But the mammoths were not the only problem. There was also the Younger Dryas. Around 12,800 years ago, just as the world was warming and the glaciers were retreating, the climate suddenly reversed. Temperatures plunged in Greenland. Ice core data shows a temperature drop of 15 degrees Fahrenheit within a single decade. In Europe, forests that had been growing for thousands of years died. Lakes froze. Glaciers began advancing again. This cold period lasted for 1,200 years. Then just as suddenly, it ended. Temperatures spiked upward. The warming resumed. But this time it was faster, more violent. The glaciers did not retreat slowly, they collapsed. What caused the Younger Dryas? What could reverse a global warming trend so abruptly? And what ended it just as suddenly? For years, the leading theory involved ocean currents. Scientists proposed that as glaciers melted, massive amounts of fresh water poured into the North Atlantic. This fresh water disrupted the ocean's circulation system, the currents that carry warm water from the tropics to the northern latitudes. When the currents shut down, the northern hemisphere plunged back into cold conditions. It was a plausible explanation, but it had problems. The timing did not quite match. The geographical spread of cooling was too wide, and it did not explain the sudden end of the Younger Dryas. If ocean currents caused the cooling, what restarted them so abruptly? Then, in 2006, a team of researchers proposed a radical alternative. What if the Younger Dryas was not caused by ocean currents at all? What if it was caused by an impact, a comet or asteroid striking the Earth, triggering a chain of catastrophes that plunged the world into chaos? The theory was called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and at first, it was dismissed as fringe science. But the evidence kept mounting. Researchers began finding a thin black layer in sediment cores dated to the start of the Younger Dryas. This layer contained high concentrations of platinum, a metal rare on Earth but common in asteroids and comets. It contained nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds formed only under the intense heat and pressure of an impact. It contained spherules, tiny glass beads created when rock melts and cools rapidly. And it contained charcoal, evidence of massive wildfires that swept across entire continents. The black layer was found in dozens of sites across North America, Europe, and Asia, all dated to the same moment, 12,800 years ago, the exact start of the Younger Dryas. In 2018, researchers in Greenland discovered a massive impact crater buried beneath the ice. The crater, located in the Hiawatha Glacier, measures 19 miles across. Dating suggested it formed sometime during the last ice age, possibly during the Younger Dryas period. If a comet or asteroid struck the Laurentide ice sheet, the massive glacier covering North America at the time, the impact would have been catastrophic. The ice sheet was over 2 miles thick in some places. A strike on that much ice would have vaporized billions of tons of water instantly. The explosion would have sent shockwaves across the continent. The heat would have melted vast sections of the glacier, releasing torrents of meltwater into the oceans. The debris thrown into the atmosphere would have blocked sunlight, plunging the world into cold and darkness. And it would explain the mammoths. An impact in the northern hemisphere would have created a blast of superheated air, followed by a rapid temperature drop as debris filled the sky. Animals caught in the shockwave would have died instantly, frozen, preserved exactly as they were found. But the impact theory remained controversial. Not all scientists were convinced. Some argued the evidence was too scattered. Others pointed out that no definitive impact crater had been conclusively dated to 12,800 years ago. The debate continued, and then geologists began finding something else. Something that could not be debated. Something written in stone, in ice, in the very bones of the Earth. The flood was real, not a myth, not a metaphor. A series of catastrophic floods that reshaped the planet between 12,000 and 6,000 years ago. In the Pacific Northwest of North America, geologists studying the landscape noticed something strange. Massive channels carved into the bedrock, valleys scoured clean of soil, giant boulders scattered across the plains, far from any mountains. It looked as if an unimaginable volume of water had torn through the region with the force of 1,000 rivers. They called it the channeled scablands, and for decades no one could explain how it formed. Then in the 1920s, a geologist named J. Harlan Bretz proposed a theory. He suggested that at the end of the Ice Age, a massive glacial lake called Lake Missoula had been dammed by ice. The lake held more water than Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined. When the ice dam broke, the entire lake emptied in a matter of days. The flood that followed was the largest ever documented on Earth. Water moving at 65 miles per hour, carving canyons, moving boulders the size of houses, reshaping hundreds of square miles of landscape in less than a week. Bretz was ridiculed at first. But eventually, the evidence became undeniable. The channeled scablands were real, the flood had happened. And it was not the only one. Geologists began finding evidence of similar megafloods around the world. In Siberia, massive flood channels suggested catastrophic outbursts from glacial lakes. In Central Asia, the same. In Europe, valleys showed signs of sudden, violent flooding far beyond anything that could be explained by normal rivers. And then there were the oceans. When scientists began mapping sea level changes over the past 20,000 years, they found something shocking. Sea levels did not rise smoothly. They rose in steps, sharp jumps, sudden increases of dozens of feet within a few centuries. The first major pulse, called Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred around 14,600 years ago. In less than 500 years, sea levels rose 65 feet. That is over 1 foot per decade. Coastlines retreated inward, islands vanished. River valleys flooded and became bays. The second pulse, Meltwater Pulse 1B, hit around 11,300 years ago. Another 25 feet of sea level rise in just a few centuries. These were not gentle transitions. These were catastrophic events, and anyone living on a coastline during these periods would have watched their world drown. But here is what made this evidence truly unsettling. The timing matched. The geological record, the ice core data, the flood deposits, the sea level changes. All of it aligned with the ancient records. The Sumerian king list described kings before the flood with impossibly long reigns. Those reigns correspond to the period before 12,000 years ago. The time before the Younger Dryas. The time before the climate chaos began. The flood described in Sumerian Egyptian, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, Chinese, and Native American traditions. All of them describe flooding between 12,000 and 6,000 years ago, exactly when meltwater pulses were raising sea levels by hundreds of feet. The frozen mammoths died around 12,800 years ago, the exact start of the Younger Dryas. The geological flood layers found at Ur-Kish and Shuropak date to between 3,500 and 2,900 years before the Common Era, exactly when the Sumerian tablets say the flood occurred. Science and myth were no longer contradicting each other. They were confirming each other. The ancient records were not religious allegories, they were eyewitness accounts, compressed, simplified, passed down through generations until the details blurred, but rooted in real events, real catastrophes, real memories of a world that ended in water and ice and fire. For thousands of years, we dismissed these records as primitive superstition. We assumed ancient people did not understand the world the way we do, that their stories were childish attempts to explain natural phenomena they could not comprehend. But we were wrong. They understood perfectly. They had lived through it. They had watched the glaciers collapse. They had fled the rising waters. They had seen their coastlines vanish, their cities drown, their world end. And they wrote it down. They carved it in stone. They passed it to their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They made certain the memory would survive, because they knew something we are only now beginning to understand. The Earth is not stable. The climate is not predictable. And the world can end far faster than we think. The Ice Age did not end slowly. It ended in a series of catastrophes that unfolded over thousands of years. Impacts, floods, volcanic eruptions, climate swings, ecosystem collapses, mass extinctions, and through it all humans survived, not easily, not comfortably, but they survived and they remembered. The mystery is not why the Ice Age ended. The mystery is how humanity made it through, how knowledge survived the chaos, how stories outlasted the catastrophe, how fragments of the old world were carried forward into the new. And that mystery leads to an even deeper question. If civilization existed before the floods, if humans had built cities on coastlines that are now underwater, if knowledge systems had been developed and then lost, then what exactly are we rebuilding? Are we the first civilization? Or are we the latest attempt? Are we inventing knowledge? Or remembering it? The ancient records suggest an answer, and it is not the one we were taught. The evidence does not whisper, it shouts. But for decades, no one was listening. Scientists were too focused on their theories. Historians were too attached to their timelines. And the idea that ancient people might have recorded real events, real catastrophes, real history, was dismissed as impossible. But then the geologists began drilling into the ice. And the ice began to tell a story that matched the ancient tablets word for word. In the 1960s, researchers from the United States, Denmark, and the Soviet Union began drilling deep into the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica. The ice in these regions is not ordinary ice, it is a layered archive. Each winter snow falls and compacts into a new layer. Each layer traps air bubbles, dust particles, volcanic ash, and chemical signatures from the atmosphere at that moment in time. Drill deep enough, and you can read the Earth's climate history going back hundreds of thousands of years. The first cores were only a few hundred feet deep, but as technology improved, the drills went deeper. In Greenland, the JESP2 core reached over 2 miles down. In Antarctica, the Vostok core penetrated nearly 3 miles into the ice. Each core was cut into sections, catalogued, and analyzed in laboratories around the world. What they found was astonishing and terrifying. The ice cores revealed that the Earth's climate is not stable. It does not change slowly and predictably. It lurches, it swings. It flips from warm to cold and back again with shocking speed. At the end of the Ice Age, the climate was warming. The data showed this clearly. Temperatures were rising. Carbon dioxide levels were increasing. The glaciers were melting. For thousands of years, the warming continued, steady, gradual, exactly as the orbital theory predicted. And then, 12,800 years ago, everything changed. Within a single decade, temperatures in Greenland dropped by 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Not over centuries, not over generations. Within 10 years, 1 decade, a child born at the start of that decade would have seen the world plunge back into Ice Age conditions before reaching adulthood. The cold snap lasted for 1,200 years, the period geologists call the Younger Dryas, and then just as suddenly it ended. Temperatures spiked upward. In some regions, warming of 10 degrees occurred in less than 3 years. 3 years. The climate did not recover slowly. It exploded back toward warmth with a violence that left scars in the ice itself. The ice cores showed something else. A thin black layer at the 12,800-year mark. The layer contained high concentrations of platinum. Platinum is extremely rare in the Earth's crust, but it is common in asteroids and comets. The layer also contained nanodiamonds, tiny diamonds that form only under extreme heat and pressure, the kind of heat and pressure generated by a cosmic impact, and it contained charcoal, lots of it. Evidence of massive wildfires that burned across entire continents at the same moment. In 2007, a team of researchers led by Richard Firestone published their findings. They had examined sediment from over 50 sites across North America, Europe, and Asia. All of them showed the same black layer. All of them dated to 12,800 years ago, the exact start of the Younger Dryas. The evidence suggested that a comet or asteroid had broken apart in the atmosphere. Fragments rained down across the northern hemisphere. Some struck the Laurentide ice sheet covering Canada and the northern United States. Others struck the ice sheets over Europe and Asia. The impacts vaporized billions of tons of ice. The explosions triggered wildfires. The debris filled the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and plunging the world into cold and darkness. In 2018, a team of researchers in Greenland found what might be the smoking gun. Using radar to scan beneath the ice, they discovered a massive impact crater buried under the Hiawatha Glacier. The crater measures 19 miles across, large enough to have been caused by a comet fragment over half a mile wide. Preliminary dating suggested the crater formed during the last ice age, possibly during the Younger Dryas. But even without a definitive impact crater, the evidence was piling up. The platinum, the nanodiamonds, the charcoal, the sudden temperature drop, the mass extinctions. Something catastrophic had happened 12,800 years ago, and the ancient records had preserved the memory. But the ice cores revealed more than just the impact. They revealed the floods. When temperatures spiked at the end of the Younger Dryas, the glaciers did not melt slowly. They collapsed. Ice sheets that had been 2 miles thick began breaking apart. Massive sections calved off into the oceans. Lakes of meltwater that had been trapped on top of the ice or dammed behind ice walls suddenly broke free. Geologists studying the evidence began calculating how much water was released. The numbers were staggering. Meltwater Pulse 1a, which occurred around 14,600 years ago, released enough water to raise global sea levels by 65 feet in less than 500 years. That is over 1.5 inches per year. It does not sound like much, but imagine living on a coastline and watching the sea creep closer every single year, watching fishing villages flood, watching farmland turn into marsh, watching entire valleys disappear beneath the waves. By the time your grandchildren were born, the coast would be miles inland from where you grew up. The places where you fished, where you built your home, where your ancestors were buried, all of it would be underwater. And Meltwater Pulse 1a was not the only one. Meltwater Pulse 1b, around 11,300 years ago, added another 25 feet. Smaller pulses continued for thousands of years. By 6,000 years ago, sea levels had risen over 400 feet from their ice age minimum. 400 feet, entire continental shelves were drowned. The evidence for this is everywhere. In the North Sea, between Britain and mainland Europe, there once existed a land called Doggerland. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, Doggerland was a vast region of forests, rivers, and marshes. It connected Britain to the rest of Europe. People lived there, hunted there, built settlements there. But as sea levels rose, Doggerland shrank. First it became an archipelago of islands. Then, around 6,500 years ago, it vanished completely beneath the waves. Today, fishing trawlers occasionally pull up evidence of Doggerland from the seafloor: stone tools, mammoth bones, antlers, fragments of wood. In 2012, researchers used seismic data to map the drowned landscape. They found river valleys, lakes, coastlines, all of it now under hundreds of feet of water. The same story repeated across Southeast Asia. The Sunda Shelf, a massive landmass connecting Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, was dry land during the Ice Age. It covered over 1 million square miles. A subcontinent. People lived there, possibly millions of people. But as the glaciers melted, the Sunda Shelf flooded. By 8,000 years ago, it was almost entirely submerged. The islands we call Indonesia today are just the mountain peaks of a drowned world. In the Persian Gulf, researchers found ancient river channels running across the seafloor. Rivers that once flowed through fertile plains are now buried underwater. Sediment cores from the Gulf showed a dramatic transition around 8,000 years ago. Below that layer, freshwater deposits. Above it, saltwater. The entire region had flooded. Off the coast of India, near the legendary city of Dwarka, sonar surveys revealed geometric patterns on the seafloor walls, platforms, right angles, structures that suggested human construction. The structures sit in water that would have been dry land before 8,000 years ago. Near the Japanese island of Unaguni, divers found massive stone formations featuring terraces, steps, and straight edges. Some researchers believe the formations are natural, Others argue they show clear signs of human modification. Either way, the formations were above water during the Ice Age. They have been submerged for at least 10,000 years. The archaeological evidence was clear. Coastlines that had been home to human populations for thousands of years were now underwater. And since approximately 70% of human settlements throughout history have been located near coastlines, near rivers, near water sources, most of the evidence of any Ice Age civilization would now be archaeologically invisible, buried under hundreds of feet of water and sediment. But some evidence survived on land, in places where the floods had left their mark, in places where people had rebuilt on top of the ruins. When Leonard Woolley excavated the ancient city of Ur in 1922, he was looking for royal tombs. He found them, but he also found something else, something he did not expect. 11 feet below the surface, his workers hid a thick layer of clean silt, water-deposited silt, 8 feet of it, sterile, untouched, the kind of layer left behind by massive, sustained flooding. Woolley stopped the excavation and examined the layer carefully. It was not river sediment, it was too thick, too uniform, and it extended across the entire site. Whatever flood had created this layer, it had been catastrophic. Below the flood layer, Woolley found more ruins, older pottery, different styles, and earlier civilization. The flood had buried it completely. And then centuries or millennia later, people had returned and built a new city on top of the ruins. The city of Ur that appears in Sumerian records, the city of Abraham. The city that marked the beginning of recorded history. But it was not the beginning, it was the continuation, the rebuilding, the recovery. Woolley consulted the Sumerian tablets, and they are written in cuneiform 4,000 years ago. The tablets described exactly what he had discovered. A great flood, a world destroyed, kingship descending from heaven again, civilization beginning anew. The same flood layer was found at other Mesopotamian sites. At Kish, excavators found a 5-foot-thick deposit of water-laid sediment. At Shirapuk, the legendary home of the flood hero Utnapishtim, they found a similar layer. At Uruk, another flood deposit. All of them dated to roughly the same period, between 3,500 and 2,900 years before the Common Era. But these floods were not global, they were regional, the result of rivers overflowing, levees breaking, and low-lying plains being inundated for months or years. They were catastrophic for the people who lived through them. But they were not the floods described in the myths, the floods that drowned the world. Those floods happened earlier, much earlier, between 12,000 and 6,000 years ago. When the glaciers collapsed and the seas rose and entire continents drowned. The regional floods in Mesopotamia were echoes, reminders, smaller repetitions of the ancient catastrophe that had reshaped the world. But there was one site that did not fit the pattern. One site that was older than it should be. One site that suggested knowledge, organization, and astronomical understanding that predated civilization itself. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began excavating a hill in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. Local shepherds had known about the site for generations. Fragments of carved stone littered the surface, but no one had realized what lay beneath. Schmidt began to dig. What he found changed archaeology forever. Buried beneath the hill were massive stone structures, circular enclosures, T-shaped pillars. Each pillar weighed between 10 and 20 tons. The pillars were carved with intricate relief animals, foxes, scorpions, snakes, bulls, vultures, geometric symbols, crescents, shapes. The structures were not crude, they were sophisticated. The pillars were quarried with precision, transported without wheels or draft animals, erected in perfect alignment. The enclosures were carefully planned, oriented to cardinal directions, designed with astronomical alignments. Schmidt expected the site to date to the Neolithic period, perhaps 6,000 years ago, perhaps 7,000. The radiocarbon dates came back, 9,600 years before the Common Era, 11,600 years old. Göbekli Tepe was built before agriculture, before pottery, before permanent settlements, before anything archaeology recognized as civilization. Yet here stood a temple complex requiring organization, planning, astronomical knowledge, and a workforce capable of quarrying, transporting, and erecting megalithic stones. And it was not alone. Nearby sites like Karahan Tepe and Navoli Ori showed similar architecture, all of them dating to the same period. All of them built by people who were supposed to be hunter-gatherers, people who were supposed to be living in small bands, moving from camp to camp, barely surviving. But the evidence said otherwise. These people were organized. They had knowledge, they had purpose, and when they were finished building, they did something extraordinary. They buried the entire site. Deliberately, filled it in with rubble, covered it with earth, preserved it like a time capsule. Why? Why build something so massive and then bury it? Schmidt believed they were protecting it, preserving the knowledge it represented, because the world was changing, the climate was shifting, and the people who built Göbekli Tepe knew their time was ending. One of the pillars at Göbekli Tepe, known as Pillar 43 or the Vulture Stone, has attracted particular attention. The carvings on the pillar appear to depict constellations, a scorpion, a vulture, circles, crescents. Researchers at the University of Edinburgh analyzed the symbols and concluded they might represent an astronomical event, a comet impact, dated, according to their interpretation, to around 10,950 years before the Common Era. If true, the people who built Göbekli Tepe were not just recording their world, they were recording its end. They were documenting the catastrophe, and then they buried the evidence, hoping it would survive until someone was ready to understand. But Göbekli Tepe was not the oldest site showing astronomical knowledge. In the Nubian desert of southern Egypt, a site called Nada Playa contains a stone circle dated to 6,000 years before the Common Era. 8,000 years old, the stones are aligned to the summer solstice. They track cardinal directions. Nearby, researchers found underground chambers containing massive stone slabs. The slabs are aligned with the stars of Orion's belt, the same constellation the pyramids of Giza would later mirror. 8,000 years ago, there were no pyramids, no pharaohs, no hieroglyphic. Yet someone in the Nubian desert was watching the stars with precision, tracking celestial cycles, building monuments to encode that knowledge. The evidence was undeniable. People at the end of the Ice Age possessed knowledge that should not have existed yet. Astronomical knowledge, architectural knowledge, organizational knowledge, knowledge that appeared suddenly in the archaeological record, fully formed, with no visible learning curve. And then, after flourishing for a few thousand years, that knowledge seemed to fade. Göbekli Tepe was buried. Nada Playa was abandoned. The Ice Age sites fell silent. And when civilization reemerged thousands of years later in Sumer and Egypt, it arrived with the same astronomical and architectural knowledge. But this time, the people who possessed it claimed they had not invented it. They claimed it had been given to them, taught to them, restored to them after the flood. The evidence, the geology, the archaeology, and the ancient records were all pointing in the same direction. The Ice Age did not end slowly. It ended in a series of catastrophes that drowned coastlines, collapsed ecosystems, and forced humanity to flee inland. Knowledge that had taken thousands of years to develop was nearly lost, but fragments survived, carried forward by refugees, preserved in oral traditions, encoded in monuments, and eventually, when stability returned, written down in the earliest texts. The Sumerian tablets, the Egyptian inscriptions, the flood myths from around the world were not mythology. They were history, compressed, distorted by time, but rooted in real events. And the question that haunted researchers now was not whether a catastrophe had happened. The evidence proved it had. The question was what had existed before the catastrophe, what had been lost, and how much knowledge had humanity once possessed, only to watch it drown beneath 400 feet of rising seas. The ice cores did not lie, the flood layers did not lie, the drowned coastlines did not lie, the ancient records did not lie. The world had ended once before, and we had forgotten. Until now, the story begins not with water, but with fire from the sky. Imagine the night sky 12,800 years ago. The stars are bright, the air is cold, the glaciers covering half the northern hemisphere glow pale blue under the moonlight. Humans huddle around fires in caves, in skin tents, in wooden shelters along coastlines that will one day be hundreds of feet underwater. They do not know what is coming. They cannot see it yet. But it is already there, hurtling toward them through the darkness of space at tens of thousands of miles per hour. A comet. Not a single massive rock, but a swarm of fragments. The parent comet had broken apart long ago, shattered by the gravity of planets or the heat of the sun. Now its children drift through the solar system in a loose cloud, invisible, silent, deadly. And on this night the Earth passes directly through that cloud. The first fragments hit the atmosphere. They do not burn up like meteors. They are too large, too dense. They slam into the air at speeds that turn atmosphere into plasma. The sky lights up, brighter than day, brighter than 1,000 suns. People stare upward in terror and wonder as streaks of fire tear across the heavens. And then the first impact. A fragment the size of a building strikes the Laurentide ice sheet over what is now Canada. The explosion is beyond anything the human mind can comprehend. The energy released is equivalent to thousands of nuclear bombs. The ice sheet, 2 miles thick, vaporizes instantly at the impact point. A shockwave tears outward at supersonic speed. The sound is heard 1,000 miles away. The ground shakes, mountains tremble, glaciers crack and collapse. But the fragment is not alone. More impacts follow. One strikes the ice over Greenland, creating the crater that will one day be discovered beneath the Hiawatha Glacier. Another hits the ice sheets over northern Europe, another over Siberia. The northern hemisphere is ablaze with impacts, the heat is unimaginable. Forests ignite, entire regions burst into flames. Animals flee in panic, but there is nowhere to run. The fires are everywhere. Mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, all of them running, stampeding, dying in the smoke and heat. Some are caught in the shock waves and killed instantly. Others are flash frozen as superheated air is suddenly replaced by freezing winds. Within hours, millions of animals are dead. Within days, the survivors are starving. The impacts on the ice sheets have another effect. Billions of tons of ice have been vaporized. The water vapor rises into the atmosphere as superheated steam. But it does not stay there, it condenses, it falls. Not as gentle rain, but as torrential downpours. Rain so heavy it flattens vegetation. Rain so sustained it does not stop for days, for weeks, for months. The floods begin. Meltwater from the shattered glaciers pours into rivers. The rivers overflow. Lakes form overnight. Dams of ice that had held back vast reservoirs of meltwater suddenly collapse. The water is released all at once, mega floods. Walls of water 50 feet high, traveling at 60 miles per hour, scoring valleys, moving boulders the size of houses, reshaping the landscape in hours. In North America, glacial Lake Missoula, dammed by ice, breaks free. The entire lake, containing more water than Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined, empties in less than a week. The flood carves the channeled Scablands, leaving scars in the bedrock that will still be visible 12,000 years later. In Siberia, similar megafloods tear through valleys. In Europe, ice dams collapse and release torrents of meltwater. In Asia, the same. Everywhere the glaciers are melting, the water is flooding, and the land is drowning. But the floods are not the worst of it. The debris thrown into the atmosphere by the impacts begins to spread. Dust, ash soot from the wildfires. Within weeks, the entire northern hemisphere is shrouded in darkness. Sunlight cannot penetrate. Temperatures plummet. The brief burst of heat from the impacts is replaced by a deadly cold. A cold that will last for over 1,000 years. This is the Younger Dryas. Not a natural climate cycle, not a slow shift in ocean currents, but the aftermath of a cosmic catastrophe. The Earth, wounded and bleeding, struggling to recover. For the people living through this, it is the end of the world. Coastlines they have known their entire lives are flooding. Forests are burning, animals are dying, the sky is dark, the air is cold. Food is scarce, entire communities are displaced. Refugees pour inland, fleeing the rising waters, the collapsing ecosystems, the chaos. And in the chaos, knowledge begins to die. The elders, the ones who remember the old songs, the old star patterns, the old techniques for making tools and medicine, they die. And the children, struggling just to survive, forget. Within a generation, complex knowledge systems degrade. Within 2 generations, they become fragments. Within 3, they are myth stories. Half-remembered legends about a time when the world was different. When the gods walked the earth. When people lived for hundreds of years. When cities stood on coasts that are now deep underwater. For 1,200 years the cold persists. Humanity survives but barely. Populations collapse. Genetic studies show a bottleneck during this period. A dramatic reduction in human numbers. The survivors are scattered, isolated, struggling. And then, as suddenly as it began, the Younger Dryas ends. Around 11,600 years ago, temperatures spike upward. Within just 3 years, some regions warm by 10 degrees. The glaciers, already weakened by the impacts, begin to collapse in earnest now. Not slowly, catastrophically. Massive sections of ice break away and slide into the oceans. The sea levels, which had been rising gradually, suddenly surge. Meltwater pulse 1b, 25 feet of sea level rise in just a few centuries. Coastlines that had managed to survive the first wave of flooding are now inundated. Islands disappear. River valleys become bays. Bays become open ocean. The people who had returned to the coasts after the Younger Dryas are forced to flee again. This time there is no going back. The old world is gone, drowned, lost beneath the waves. The places where their grandparents had lived, where temples had stood, where knowledge had been kept, all of it is underwater now. But the survivors do not give up. They carry what they can, not physical objects, those are lost. But memories, stories, oral traditions, they teach their children about the world that was, about the cities that drowned, about the knowledge that must not be forgotten, about the stars, the cycles, the patterns that govern the earth and sky. And slowly, over thousands of years, humanity rebuilds. Small settlements become villages, villages become towns, towns become cities, agriculture spreads, pottery is developed, trade networks emerge, and eventually, around 3,500 years before the Common Era, writing appears. But the writing does not describe a beginning, it describes a restoration, a recovery, a rebuilding of what was lost. The Sumerians, writing on clay tablets in southern Iraq, list kings who ruled before the flood. They describe the Apkallu, The 7 sages who emerged from the waters after the catastrophe to teach humanity the lost arts, city building, irrigation, astronomy, mathematics, law, medicine. The Sumerians are not inventing these systems, they are learning them, being taught, restoring what their ancestors had once known. In Egypt, priests carve inscriptions claiming their temples are copies of older structures, built according to plans from the first time, the time of the gods, the time before the flood. They are not creating, they are remembering. In India, the Vedas describe the Saptarishi, the 7 sages who preserved knowledge through the deluge and taught it to the survivors. In Greece, myths speak of Prometheus bringing fire and knowledge to humanity. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl arrives after the flood to teach civilization. In Peru, Viracocha emerges from Lake Titicaca to instruct the survivors. Different cultures, different names, same story, knowledge lost, knowledge restored. Teachers appearing after the catastrophe to help humanity rebuild, and the geological evidence confirms every detail. The impacts, the wildfires, the floods, the climate chaos, the extinctions, the rising seas, the drowned coastlines, all of it happened exactly as the myths describe. Between 12,000 and 6,000 years ago, the world was reshaped, and humanity, clinging to survival, carried forward the memory of what had been lost. But the story does not end with the catastrophe, it continues. Because the survivors were determined, they knew that knowledge, once lost, might never be recovered. So they encoded it, in myths, in monuments, in temple alignments, in star charts carved on stone. Göbekli Tepe, built 11,600 years ago, was not just a temple. It was a library, a record, an astronomical observatory documenting the comet impact that had nearly destroyed the world. And when the builders knew their culture was fading, they buried it, preserved it, protected it so that someday, when humanity was ready, the knowledge could be rediscovered. Nada Playa in Egypt, 8,000 years old, encoded stellar alignments, tracking Orion, tracking the solstices, preserving the astronomical knowledge that would later appear fully formed in Egyptian civilization. The megalithic sites across Europe, Stonehenge, Newgrange, Karnak, all of them aligned to celestial events. All of them built by cultures that were supposed to be primitive, but they were not primitive, they were inheritors, carrying forward fragments of knowledge from before the flood. And when writing finally emerged, the first thing recorded was not daily life, not trade receipts, not kings and queens. The first thing recorded was the memory of the catastrophe, the flood, the lost world, the warning. Because the survivors knew, they understood. The earth is not stable, the climate can change suddenly, civilization can fall, knowledge can be lost, and it can happen again. The ancient records were not religious texts, they were survival manuals, instructions for the future, warnings carved in stone. Remember what happened, remember what was lost. Do not forget. Do not let the knowledge die. For 12,000 years, we ignored those warnings. We dismissed them as myth, as superstition, as primitive attempts to explain a world ancient people did not understand. But we were wrong. They understood perfectly. They had lived through it. They had watched the sky burn. They had fled the floods. They had rebuilt from ruins. And they wrote it all down, in every language, on every continent. The Ice Age did not end slowly. It ended in fire and water and darkness. It ended with impacts from space, megafloods reshaping continents, and climate chaos killing half the animals on Earth. It ended with humanity reduced to scattered refugees, clinging to coastlines that were drowning beneath their feet. And when it was over, when the waters finally stopped rising and the climate finally stabilized, the survivors looked at what remained. A fraction of what had been. Fragments of knowledge, scraps of memory. And they made a choice. They would not let it die. They would rebuild, they would remember, they would warn the future. And that is what the ancient records are. Not myths, not legends, but warnings, memories, instructions, written by people who had seen the world end and were determined that their descendants would know the truth. The geological evidence proves they were right. The ice cores prove it, the flood layers prove it, the drowned coastlines prove it, the mass extinctions prove it, the impact craters prove it. The Ice Age ended in catastrophe, and the survivors remembered, they told the story. They carved it in stone. They passed it down through 10,000 years of oral tradition until finally, when writing was invented, they pressed it into clay and carved it into temple walls and painted it in sacred texts. And now, 12,000 years later, we are finally listening. We are finally reading the records they left. We are finally understanding what they were trying to tell us. The world ended once before. It can end again. The ice can melt. The seas can rise. The climate can shift. The coasts can drown. And when it happens, will we be ready? Will we preserve our knowledge? Will we warn the future? Or will we, like the lost civilization before us, vanish beneath the waves, leaving only myths and fragments for those who come after? The ancient records give us the answer. They survived because someone chose to remember, someone chose to preserve, someone chose to warn. Now the choice is ours. The story should have stayed in Mesopotamia, a regional myth, a local legend, something specific to one river valley, one culture, one people. But it did not stay there. It spread, or rather it was already everywhere, waiting to be discovered. When scholars began collecting flood myths from around the world, they expected variations, different details, different causes, different outcomes. What they found instead was uniformity. The same story, told in different languages, separated by oceans and mountains and thousands of miles, yet describing the exact same sequence of events with the exact same structure. In ancient Sumer, the story was recorded in cuneiform on clay tablets. The hero was named Utnapishtim. He was warned by the god Enki that a great flood was coming. The other gods had decided to destroy humanity. Enki told Utnapishtim to build a boat, a massive boat, seal it with tar, load it with animals, seeds, and his family. The rains came. The world drowned. Everything died. After 7 days and 7 nights, the boat came to rest on a mountain. Utnapishtim released birds. A dove returned. A swallow returned. A raven did not return. The raven had found land, the plover. Humanity could begin again. In the Hebrew Bible, the story is almost identical. The hero is named Noah. He is warned by God that a flood is coming to cleanse the earth of wickedness. God tells Noah to build an ark, specific dimensions, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. Seal it with pitch. Load it with animals, 2 of every kind. Noah obeys. The rains come. The fountains of the deep burst open. The waters cover the earth. Everything with breath dies. After 40 days and 40 nights, the ark rests on Mount Ararat. Noah releases birds. A raven, a dove. The dove returns with an olive branch. Humanity begins again. 2 cultures, 2 languages, 2 time periods. Same story, but it does not stop there. In India, the sacred texts called the Puranas tell the story of Manu. Manu is washing his hands in a river when a small fish asks for protection. Manu places the fish in a jar. The fish grows. Manu moves it to a pond. It grows larger. Manu moves it to a lake. It grows even larger. Finally, Manu releases it into the ocean. The fish, which is actually the god Vishnu, warns Manu that a great flood is coming. Build a boat, the fish says. Take the 7 sages. Take seeds of every plant. Take animals. The flood comes. The waters rise. Everything is destroyed. Manu's boat through the storm. When the waters recede, Manu and the sages emerge. Humanity begins again. Civilization is restored. Same structure. Same warning, same boat, same destruction. Same survival, same rebuilding. In Greece, the poet Ovid recorded the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha. Zeus, angered by human wickedness, decides to destroy the world with a flood. Deucalion, son of Prometheus, is warned. He builds a boat. He and his wife Pyrrha survive. For 9 days and 9 nights, they float on the waters. The boat finally rests on Mount Parnassus. They emerge. The world is empty, silent, dead. They pray to the gods for guidance. They are told to throw the bones of their mother behind them. They realize this means stones, the bones of the earth. They throw stones. The stones become people. Humanity is reborn. Same flood, same survival, same rebuilding, different names. Same story. In China, ancient records describe the great floods during the reign of Emperor Yao. The waters rose and covered the land. Mountains were submerged. Valleys became seas. The hero Gun tried for 9 years to stop the floods by building dams and barriers. He failed. His son Yu succeeded by dredging channels and guiding the waters into rivers and seas. The work took 13 years. Yu barely rested. He passed his own home 3 times but did not stop to enter. When the work was finished, the land was safe. Civilization could continue. The Chinese version does not include a boat, but it includes the flood, the destruction, the hero who saves humanity, the long struggle to restore the world. In Central America, the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Maya, describes multiple world ages. Each age ends in catastrophe. The first world was destroyed by jaguars, the second by fire, the third by wind, the fourth by flood. The waters rose. The sky fell. The earth was dark. Everything was destroyed. The gods created a new world, a new humanity. But the memory of the destroyed worlds remained, written in the stars, encoded in the calendar, passed down through generations. The Maya were not describing myth. They were describing history, a history of catastrophes, a history of worlds ending and beginning again. And the flood was central to that history. In South America, the Inca told the story of Viracocha. Before the Inca, the land was inhabited by giants, but the giants were wicked. Viracocha sent a great flood to destroy them. The waters covered the earth. Only 1 man and 1 woman survived, hidden in a cave. When the waters receded, Viracocha emerged from Lake Titicaca. He created the sun, the moon, and the stars. He fashioned new humans from stone. He taught them language, agriculture, architecture, and astronomy. He traveled across the land instructing the people, and then disappeared across the ocean, promising to return. Same flood, same destruction. Same teacher arriving after the catastrophe to restore civilization. Same pattern. In North America, indigenous tribes from coast to coast preserved flood traditions. The Ojibwe tell of a great flood sent to cleanse the earth. One man, Wainabuzu, survived by climbing a mountain. He sent animals to dive beneath the waters and bring up mud. The muskrat succeeded. Wainabuzu used the mud to create new land. The world was reborn. The Hopi described 4 worlds. The first world was destroyed by fire, the second by ice, the third by flood. The survivors climbed into hollow reeds and floated on the waters. When the flood ended, they emerged into the 4th world, the world we live in now. The Salish of the Pacific Northwest tell of a time when the ocean rose and covered the land. Only the mountain peaks remained above water. People tied their canoes to the peaks and survived. When the waters fell, they descended and repopulated the valleys. The Haida of the Pacific coast describe a great flood that covered the earth. One family survived in a canoe. They drifted for many days. Finally, the waters receded. A raven released from the canoe found land. The family emerged and became the ancestors of the Haida people. Different tribes, different languages, different regions, same flood, same survival, same new beginning. In Australia, Aboriginal oral traditions describe a time when the sea levels were lower. Stories passed down for over 10,000 years describe coastlines, islands, and landmarks that are now underwater. Researchers have confirmed that these stories accurately describe the landscape as it existed during the Ice Age, before the seas rose. The Aboriginal people remembered. For 10,000 years they remembered, and they passed the memory down through song, through dance, through story. In the Pacific Islands, traditions describe entire islands vanishing beneath the waves. Legends tell of ancestors fleeing rising waters, traveling across the ocean in canoes, searching for new land. Modern archaeology has confirmed that many low-lying islands in the Pacific were indeed submerged as sea levels rose after the Ice Age. The pattern is undeniable. Every inhabited continent, every culture with an oral tradition or written records, all of them describe the same event: a great flood, a world destroyed, a few survivors, civilization rebuilt. These are not borrowed stories. The cultures that told them had no contact with each other. The Aboriginal Australians did not know the Sumerians. The Maya did not know the Hindus. The Hopi did not know the Greeks. Yet they all told the same story. Because they were not inventing mythology, they were preserving memory. The memory of an event so catastrophic, so world-changing that every human population on Earth carried the story forward, generation after generation, for over 10,000 years. But the flood myths were not the only evidence of a shared global memory. There was something else. Something that suggested the world before the flood had been more advanced than we imagined, more connected, more knowledgeable. The astronomical alignments, the megalithic structures, the mathematical precision, the advanced knowledge appearing simultaneously in cultures that were supposed to have no contact with each other. In Egypt, the pyramids of Giza aligned to true north with astonishing accuracy. The layout mirrors the constellation Orion. The shafts inside the Great Pyramid point to specific stars. The entire complex encodes mathematical constants, pi, qui, the proportions of the Earth itself. In England, Stonehenge aligns to the summer solstice. The stones are positioned to track the movements of the sun and moon with precision. The builders understood celestial cycles. They understood geometry. They understood engineering. In Turkey, Göbekli Tepe, built 11,600 years ago, contains pillars aligned to celestial events. The carvings may represent constellations. The site may document a comet impact. In Cambodia, Angkor Wat mirrors the constellation Draco, as it appeared around 10,500 years ago. The temple complex encodes astronomical knowledge, precession, celestial cycles, the movements of planets and stars. In Peru, the Nazca lines stretch across the desert. Massive geoglyphs visible only from the air. Some researchers believe they represent constellations. Star maps, astronomical markers. In Mexico, the pyramids of Teotihuacan align to celestial events. The layout mirrors astronomical patterns. The measurements encode mathematical knowledge. Different continents, different cultures, different time periods. Same knowledge, same precision, same astronomical understanding. How could cultures separated by oceans and thousands of miles all possess the same advanced knowledge? How could they all build monuments encoding the same celestial patterns? How could they all track precession, a 26,000-year cycle that requires centuries of continuous observation to detect? The conventional explanation is independent invention. Human brains are similar. When people look at the sky, they see the same patterns. When they build monuments, they naturally align them to the sun and stars. It is coincidence, convergence, nothing more. But that explanation is starting to crack. Because the precision is too exact. The patterns are too similar. The knowledge is too advanced. And most troubling of all, before agriculture, before writing, before civilization as we understand it, there is another explanation, one that the ancient records themselves provide. The knowledge was not invented independently, it was inherited, passed down, taught, preserved from a time before the flood, from a world that had already developed astronomy, mathematics, architecture and engineering, a world that drowned when the seas rose. But before it drowned, some of its knowledge survived, carried forward by refugees, encoded in myth, preserved in oral traditions, and eventually rebuilt by the successor civilizations that emerged from the ruins. The Egyptians did not discover precession, they inherited it. The Maya did not invent their calendars, they restored them. The builders of Bekli Tip did not suddenly develop astronomical knowledge, they were recording what they had been taught. The flood myths worldwide are not describing a simple natural disaster, they are describing the end of a global civilization, a civilization that had reached a level of sophistication we are only now beginning to recognize. A civilization that built on coastlines now hundreds of feet underwater. A civilization that watched its world drown and made certain the memory would survive. And that memory did survive. In every culture, on every continent, told in every language, the same story, the same warning, the same truth. The world ended once before, and we are the descendants of the survivors. The wind blows across the desert tonight. It carries dust that was once stone, stone that was once mountains, mountains that watched the ice melt and the seas rise and the old world drown. Beneath that dust, memory sleeps. Memory pressed into clay tablets, memory carved into temple walls, memory whispered through 10,000 years of songs and stories, memory that refuses to die. Even when the world that created it has been erased, we stand now at a strange moment in history. For the first time in 12,000 years, we have the tools to read what the ancients left behind. We can drill into ice and read the climate. We can map the seafloor and find the drowned coastlines. We can carbon date the monuments and confirm they are older than they should be. We can translate the tablets and discover they were telling the truth all along. The Ice Age did not end slowly, it ended in catastrophe. Fire from the sky, floods that reshaped continents, climate chaos that killed half the animals on Earth, and humanity, reduced to scattered refugees, watching their world vanish beneath rising waters. But they survived, and more than that, they remembered. They remembered because they knew something we are only now beginning to understand. Knowledge is fragile. Civilization is fragile. The world can change faster than we think, and when it changes, everything we have built, everything we have learned, everything we think is permanent can be lost, not slowly, not with warning, but suddenly, catastrophically, completely. The survivors of the flood knew this. They had lived it. They had watched cities drown. They had fled inland from coasts that would never return. They had seen the knowledge of generations disappear as elders died and children forgot. They understood that memory, without preservation, dies within 3 generations. So they made a choice. They would not let it die. They would carve it in stone. They would press it into clay. They would sing it in songs. They would encode it in myths. They would build monuments that aligned to the stars, so that even if the language was forgotten, the knowledge would remain, written in stone and sky. And they did something else, something profound. They wrote warnings. The flood myths are not just historical records. They are survival instructions. Remember what happened. Remember what was lost. Remember that the world can end. Remember that knowledge must be preserved. Remember that we have been here before. For 12,000 years, we ignored those warnings. We called them myths. We called them primitive superstition. We assumed ancient people did not understand the world the way we do. But they understood better than we do, because they had survived what we have only studied. The question now is not whether the Ice Age ended in catastrophe. The evidence proves it did. The question is what we do with that knowledge. Do we listen to the warnings carved in stone? Do we preserve what we have learned? Do we prepare for the possibility that the earth, which has convulsed before, might convulse again? Or do we ignore the warnings, as every civilization before us seems to have done, until it is too late? The ice remembers. It holds the record of impacts and temperature swings and climate chaos locked in frozen layers stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. The ice knows that stability is temporary, that the earth is dynamic, that catastrophe is not an anomaly. It is a pattern. The stones remember too, the megalithic monuments, the temples aligned to stars, the pyramids encoding mathematical constants. They were not built for decoration, they were not built for worship. They were built as archives, libraries in stone, knowledge preserved in geometry and alignment, waiting for a future generation smart enough to read it. And the myths remember. Every culture, every continent, every language. The same story, the same warning, the world ended. It can end again, do not forget. We are the first generation in 12,000 years capable of confirming what the ancients were trying to tell us. We have the technology, we have the data. We have the ice cores, the flood layers, the drowned coastlines, the impact evidence. We have everything we need to understand. The question is whether we have the wisdom to act on that understanding. Because here is the truth the ancient records whisper across the millennia. We are not the first. We are not the most advanced civilization to ever walk this planet. We are simply the latest, the most recent attempt, the newest chapter in a story that has been written and erased and rewritten more times than we know. Somewhere beneath the waves, on continental shelves now hundreds of feet underwater, lie the ruins of what came before. Cities we will never excavate, knowledge we will never recover, lives that were lived, dreams that were dreamed, civilizations that rose and fell and drowned, leaving only myths and fragments. And we are building on top of those fragments, using knowledge we think we invented but may have only remembered, following patterns we think we discovered but may have only inherited. The Sumerians said their knowledge came from the Apkallu, the sages who emerged after the flood. The Egyptians said their temples were copies of structures from the first time. The Maya said their calendars were restored from previous world ages. The Hindus said the sages preserved knowledge through the deluge. Every culture claimed the same thing. We did not invent this, we recovered it, we restored it, we are rebuilding what was lost. And now, looking at the evidence, we realize they were telling the truth. So what does that mean for us? What does it mean to live in a civilization that is not the first, not the only, but simply the latest? It means we carry a responsibility to remember, to preserve, to pass forward, because if the cycle repeats, if the earth convulses again, if the ice melts or the climate shifts or the coasts drown, then what we leave behind will determine whether the next civilization starts from zero or starts from memory. Will we be like the survivors of the flood, carving warnings in stone, encoding knowledge in monuments, preserving the truth in stories that outlast empires? Or will we assume that stability is permanent, that progress is inevitable, that catastrophe only happens to ancient people in myths? The choice is ours, and the choice matters, because history, real history, the kind written in ice and stone and rising seas, suggests that the earth does not care about our assumptions. It operates on its own time scale, its own rules, its own cycles, and when those cycles turn, as they have turned before, the only thing that survives is what we choose to preserve. The wind blows across the ruins tonight, across the broken pillars of Göbekli Tepe, deliberately buried to protect what they represented. Across the submerged coastlines where cities once stood, across the ice fields that still hold the chemical signatures of the comet that nearly ended the world. And somewhere in that wind, if you listen closely, you can hear the voice of the survivors, the ones who carved the warnings, the ones who pressed the stories into clay, the ones who built the monuments and aligned them to stars and trusted that someday, someone would be wise enough to read what they had written. They are speaking to us now, across 12,000 years, across the gap between their world and ours. And they are saying the same thing in every language, in every myth, in every carved stone. Remember, preserve, prepare. The world can end. It has ended before. It will end again. And when it does, memory is the only thing that survives. We have been given a gift, the gift of their warnings, the gift of their preserved knowledge, the gift of their determination that the truth would not die, even when their world did. The question is what we do with that gift. Do we honor it? Do we learn from it? Do we build our own warnings into stone and ice and story, so that if catastrophe comes, the next generation will know what happened and why? Or do we forget, as every generation seems to forget, until the cycle repeats and the story begins again? The ancient records do not give us the answer. They only give us the question. And the question is simple. Will we remember? Will we preserve? Will we be worthy of the knowledge that was carried through flood and fire and darkness, so that we might stand here today, reading their words, understanding their warnings? The wind does not answer. It only blows, carrying dust, carrying memory, carrying the whisper of a world that ended and the hope that we, the inheritors of that ending, will be wise enough to remember. The ice still holds its secrets, locked in layers 2 miles deep, waiting for us to drill deeper, to read further back, to understand more completely. The stones still stand, aligned to stars, encoding knowledge, preserving patterns we are only beginning to recognize, and the myths still circulate, passed down, translated, studied, waiting for the moment when we finally stop calling them myths and start calling them what they are. History, compressed, distorted by time, but true. We stand at the edge of understanding, 1 foot in the world of our ancestors who knew catastrophe, 1 foot in the world of our descendants who may yet face it again. And the choice of what we carry forward, what we preserve, what we choose to remember is ours. The ancient records have done their job. They survived. They reached us. They delivered their message. Now it is our turn. Our responsibility. Our choice. Will we carve our own warnings? Will we preserve our own knowledge? Will we make certain that if the seas rise again, if the climate shifts again, if the world ends again, someone will remember us the way we now remember them? The answer is not written in stone, not yet. It is being written now. In every choice we make, in every truth we preserve, in every story we pass down. And when the wind blows across our ruins thousands of years from now, what will it carry? What memory will we leave behind? What warning will we carve? The question is ours to answer. And the time to answer is now. Because the earth, patient as stone, does not wait, it turns, it shifts, it moves. And when it moves, the only thing that survives is what we choose to remember. And so we return to where we began. To this moment. To this night. Wherever you are in the world right now. Whatever hour keeps you company, you have traveled with me through 12,000 years of memory. Through ice and stone and rising seas. Through catastrophe and survival and the determination of ancient people who refused to let the truth die. That same determination lives in us now. The capacity to remember. The capacity to preserve. The capacity to look at the past and understand that it is also the future, unless we choose differently. If this story has resonated with you, if these ancient warnings have spoken to something deep inside, take a moment to like this video. Subscribe if you want to continue exploring the mysteries that sleep between history and legend. Your support keeps these stories alive. It keeps the memory flowing forward. And perhaps that is what the ancient records were really trying to teach us. That memory is not passive. It is active. It requires effort. It requires choice. It requires each generation to pick up the story and carry it forward. We are the carriers now, the inheritors, the ones who remember. And in remembering, we honor those who survived the flood, who carved the warnings, who preserved the knowledge, who trusted that someday someone would listen. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for carrying this story forward into your own time, your own place, your own understanding. The ancient world is not dead. It lives in every myth we translate, in every monument we study, in every ice core we drill, in every moment we choose to remember instead of forget. And perhaps that is the real ending. Not an ending at all, but a continuation, a thread stretching from the survivors of the flood to us to whoever comes after, a thread of memory, of knowledge, of warning, of hope. May you sleep well tonight, knowing that the story continues, that memory survives, that we are part of something larger than ourselves, something that stretches back 12,000 years and forward into a future we cannot yet see. The wind blows across the desert one last time, carrying dust, carrying memory, carrying the whisper of ancient voices who once stood where we stand now, who once looked at a changing world and chose to remember, chose to preserve, chose to warn. And in that wind, in that dust, in that memory the story lives, waiting, patient as stone, steady as ice, constant as the sea, until the next person asks the question, until the next generation listens, until the next civilization looks at the ruins and wonders, and remembers. Good night.